Chuck, it's great to see you today.
Great to see you, Jason.
So, Chuck, you were a squadron leader in the Navy SEALs, in SEAL Team 6. And today, and since the beginning of the war, you've been following what's going on in Ukraine very, very well. So, there's obviously been a lot going on in recent days. We see what's happening in Kyiv, but we also see in Washington, there's been conversations already with Moscow. There's also the Munich Security Conference going on. There's just a ton of things going on, and rumors about a peace deal already being in the works. What do you make of all this?
The one thing I can make about it is there is a lot of uncertainty. And at least half of that uncertainty is manufactured by one of the principals attending the Munich Security Council conference, rather. The United States has appeared to do everything it possibly can do to confuse rather than clarify the situation. Some people have noted uh, at least one conversation between Putin and Trump. Some people feel there may have already been concessions made or acknowledged or placed upon the table, which isn't exactly the way you want to start a negotiation by talking about things that might be given away. But I think some of the things that you and I are going to talk about tonight are reading between the lines and contrasting things that principals and parties have said and some actual facts on the ground, which cast an entirely different light on the speculation and even the uncertainty, because you and I know some things that are certain.
Absolutely the case. One thing that they've talked about a lot recently, though, is that Donald Trump is anxious to make a deal, perhaps a deal at any cost. And I think it's a little bit alarming that already the U.S. has come out and said what it's willing to part with. Just yesterday, the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, said that the U.S. no longer supported membership for Ukraine in NATO, and it did not think that reobtaining the 1991 borders, that are the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine, is realistic. Both of those are a policy reversal for the United States, which for the past 3 years has said that it does want Ukraine and NATO and that it does want to help Ukraine restore its 1991 borders. How should we interpret that? And why do you think it is that the White House decided to show its hand before the formal negotiations began, that it's already willing to give up on some of the things that it had promised to Ukraine?
Well, I think one thing we can say is these are very much political promises. And everyone listening in the United States knows that a politician's promise generally doesn't mean very much. Let's talk about something that is a fact. The war is not going well for Russia, right? They are nowhere near winning this war in Ukraine. I'm going to go out on a limb here, but not very far. There will be no massive Russian offensive against Kyiv this summer, or the next summer, or the summer afterwards. Russia is losing about 400,000 people a year in Ukraine. That isn't going to work out, and it's not sustainable. It's Russia that needs peace negotiations. We have a president of the United States. Maybe he is anxious to make a deal, perhaps at any cost. But let's look at this in the real light. Somebody who was a superpower started a war that was supposed to last 72 hours. By May, Russia will have lost 1 million people in Ukraine. That's not winning. Who needs the peace deal? It's Putin, not Trump.
I totally agree with you. There's nothing good for Russia right now. We see that domestically, 40% of the national budget is going to pay for this war. We see that inflation is extremely high. It's in fact about 27% or more. And more than that, the banks are overextended with toxic loans and they could start to collapse. And when they do, it could very well have a domino effect, hitting one bank after the next, leading to hyperinflation or other significant problems. So certainly, Russia has a very keen need to end this war now. And I think when we look at it militarily, things aren't going so great. What's been happening in Kursk Oblast recently?
Resurgent Ukrainian offensive activity, especially to the southeast. Ukraine holds a pocket roughly shaped like the nation of India. It's about 400 or 500 square kilometers. Recently, it has expanded. You'll remember that Putin set a self-set deadline to have the Ukrainians out of Kursk by January 20th in time for Trump's inauguration. Not only did that not happen, but it looked for a period as though, and this I believe was true, North Korean troops had suffered so many casualties they were withdrawn from combat. Now they have been put back in, but Kursk is a showcase of Russian military ineptitude. And remember, this is a home game for the Russians and an away game for the Ukrainians. I see the Kursk lodgment owned by Ukraine as being safe at least until the spring. A little bit of a projection on my part, but the terrain and the ground lines of communication are such, and Ukrainian tactics are such that I think they're going to hold on to it at least into the spring and maybe into the summer.
That doesn't look very good for Russia at all. So, looking ahead, what do you think the outcomes might be, or what should we expect from what's happening in the Munich Security Conference? Or what do you think might happen in the next few weeks if the U.S. policy towards Ukraine changes?
They have intimated that changes could be possible. Previously, 3 years, the United States position was there was a path for Ukraine to arrive at NATO membership, which I will say right now is the one thing that will guarantee Ukraine's security going forward. Okay, we've heard a lot about territorial concessions that the U.S. is indicating may be necessary for Ukraine to make. And we've also heard from Washington some sort of quid pro quo about precious metals and rare earth metals resources from Ukraine being exchanged for help from the United States. It's very interesting to me, though, in Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, we're talking about lithium, yanthium, cerium, tritium, uranium, manganese. All of these resources are located in terrain that is presently held and occupied by Russia. Russia should realize that. As far as territorial concessions go, it appears to me at this point, reading between the lines, it's Russia that's going to have to make some territorial concessions, especially in the East. And we are talking about the nexus and center of gravity of the war here, right? Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson. That's almost the whole front line.
Certainly the case. Russia certainly is in those regions because it wants those metals and understands there's value there. If you look at a map, the overlap of where Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there's no doubt about it. And if you look at 2014, you see the same thing. There is a specific interest in going for those parts of the country that had the rare earth metals. And also those parts of the country that had the heaviest industry, specifically steel, and those that were doing things like coke for the steel production, knowing that if they were able to cripple those and take the ports in southern Ukraine, that would guarantee that Ukraine can never be economically independent. It'd be an agricultural society, a broken one that couldn't even export unless it went through Russia to use its ports, the occupied ports that would be in southern Ukraine. So I think that's why many people don't realize Crimea is so important. It's not just this area over there, it's largely Russian speaking. No, think of it geostrategically. This is very important because with that, with the control of Crimea, it allows Russia to control the ports and it prevents Ukraine from ever being totally free, even though it's right up on the water. So what we see here is that Russia has an interest of being almost a colonialist force. Obviously, it's committing a genocide in Ukraine, but it's a very clear economic interest as well, which is one, to take over the means of production, to take over the things of the highest economic value, which then they can export back to Russia. But secondly, by crippling things like the steel industry, it takes Ukraine off the map as a competitor of Russia, as Russia is one of the largest steel producers in the world. So there's a very clear economic argument for what Russia is doing, which is to cripple Ukraine and also to make sure that it can take out anything of economic value before expanding. Now, if Donald Trump is already talking about a $500 billion deal to export or to extract, I should say, the fine earth metals from Ukraine, well, then there's a competition. Now there's a problem. Russia wants those and the Americans want those. But in no case, at this point, are they in Ukrainian territory. The vast majority is in Russian occupied territory. So how does the U.S. expect to actually get those unless it gives Ukrainians the weapons they need to liberate those territories, or unless it forces Russia out of those territories through its own force. So, what do you see?
I want to give you a pat on the back because you gave me this speech 3 years ago when we first started working together. And it's good to be reminded of this and for our listeners to reframe the conflict for a second as we go into Munich, right? This is a genocidal war. This is a war over culture. This is a war where hundreds of civilians die every day. This is a war that Russia started. This is not a war that Ukraine provoked. Everyone sees that. Now let's look at it slightly differently. This is a war that was started by Russia for economic reasons. Much as Hitler went into the Sudetenland, much as Hitler decided he wanted Czechoslovakia for their industries, for their resources. Now you start reframing the war. Now you've got evidence to put this, just as Jason has said, this is an imperial war of conquest, and it's about this. It's about money. And face it, castrating Ukraine going forward economically, removing it as a competitor to Russia. And you're absolutely right about if Trump wants rare earth minerals, if he wants these resources, a couple things are going to have to happen. The Russians are going to have to leave those areas, and there will be a vast expenditure of money to rehabilitate the mines and foundries and other facilities that Russia has systematically destroyed in those areas. Vuhledar, uh, a dozen, Severodonetsk, Mariupol famously, that Russia has taken over and either exported all the machinery or simply destroyed it in place. Massive reinvestment coming from the United States to exploit resources jointly with Ukraine. But you are right, in areas that Russia occupies. So to Mr. Lavrov, you might want to write this down in your notebook. Somebody's going to have to give.
Absolutely. But it is amazing that Russia really does behave like it's the 18th century or the 19th century, the earlier part. I mean, when you look at what Russia does, it does show up like Leopold II in the Congo. Just comes in there, treats the locals terribly, enslaves them, kills them, tortures them, rapes them, and then extracts whatever has value, leaving nothing of value behind for the local population. They just are truly like a force from more than 100 years ago. It's hard to imagine that modern Russia is so primitive, but in fact, it really is. And we've seen it recently in the Russian military when they're sending out groups of soldiers who have been injured, using crutches or even crawling as they approach Ukrainian positions. I wanted to ask you about that. What's the point of that? It just seems so absurd to see men who can't even walk, can't even hold a gun, crawling towards the Ukrainian positions. Why do they do that with their own soldiers?
Because they're running out of soldiers. It isn't just barbarous cruelty to drag these wounded soldiers out of military hospitals and throw them onto the line of contact, because it is that. It is monstrous and barbaric. And not even the Waffen SS did that to their own people. But Russia is, because they have to. Why is it that Russian troops are zooming towards the line of contact in golf carts? Why are they stealing civilian vehicles, loading them up with mortar rounds, and creating gigantic explosions on the battlefield? Because they have to. They've lost all of their trucks. Why is it that Russia only conducts in column attacks in broad daylight? Because they don't have any other tactics. They don't have soldiers who can do anything more complicated than get in a line, fix bayonets, and run across an open field where they are slaughtered daily in their thousands, right? This war is a disaster for Putin. And as you pointed out, it's an economic disaster for Russia. And I'm going to go out a little bit on a limb here. It may already be a mortal wound for the Russian military and the Russian economy. One more thing I'll say. Russia has already lost 10,000 main battle tanks in in the war here. There are only 700 main, no, there are 900 main battle tanks owned by all of the European NATO countries. They've lost 10 times the number of tanks in NATO in Europe in 3 years. Jason, somebody should whisper in the ear, defeat. They are defeated. And they are. Putin needs this desperately. And hopefully the United States can see, look, there isn't a hurry. I advise the United States to remember that North Vietnam argued over the shape of the table in the Paris peace talks for 6 months. So I think we should start talking about what the table's going to look like and not what Ukraine's going to have to give away.
Absolutely. Increasingly, I find it to be just harder and harder to believe that some people think it's a credible argument that Russia is winning. In fact, I think that Russia has taken such a blow, not only militarily, but in prestige. Before this, as you well enough recall, Russia always did have that prestige as the world's second greatest army. But today, to watch what's unfolding in Ukraine is simply unbelievable. To see that they are sending injured men to crawl towards the Ukrainian front, or to see that they're sending men in golf carts to go up against tanks or against machine guns, is simply insane. It is hard to believe, but that's modern Russia. And Russia doesn't have much else to offer. Before, it always had the ability to be a credible alternative to the United States, especially during the Cold War. So it was always who other countries could turn to. But after you see this, after you see that they could not back their allies, such as we saw in Syria recently, well, it's very clear that Russia cannot be counted on. Russia is losing global influence, global power, global prestige, and its military has already been seen to be too weak to do anything. At this point, if any country wished to attack Russia, I don't know how they'd be able to repel an attack. Do you?
No, they wouldn't. And, UK Defense Intelligence, I found this hard to believe. It's gospel now. UK Defense Intelligence assessed that Russia has 95% of its military capability in Ukraine. That means it has 5% to service the rest of its global national security interests. That obviously is a crazy imbalance. But I'd go one step farther and say that Russia is weaker now militarily than it has ever been since before World War II. Well, why do I say that? Well, they've lost 10,000 main battle tanks. They're going to hit 1 million casualties next May. You can't tell me that they sustained that kind of hit and it just means nothing. They can't produce weapons at the rate that they're losing them. And as you pointed out, they're spending 45% of their budget on military. That's not sustainable. And they have one more egregious area of vulnerability, and that is sanctions can be enforced on their global energy trading apparatus. These shadow fleets, sketchy deals, brokers, flags of convenience. And interestingly, it's Russia that drew attention to this shadow fleet by using those same vessels to sabotage Baltic Sea cables. This is another thing the United States should concentrate on. You should never arrive at a negotiation with Russia without sitting down and putting your pistol on the table. And our pistol is no more oil trading for you. No, no more oil trading. Your ships, they're unfit. They are not crewed adequately. No safety procedures. They don't have insurance. You've already had two major environmental disasters, ex-nay on the Ipshay. I think that will be a point that will also come out, but I don't know.
Well, we've seen recently that both India and China, which are the biggest purchasers of the oil coming from Russia, have said that they are going to lay off that. They're afraid of the secondary sanctions that will come from the US. Now, keep in mind, oil and gas for Russia makes up 40-50% of their total national budget. When you take in all the other jobs and other work that goes into extracting that and exporting that. So, the situation for Russia is going to get more and more complicated. And there's no reason to think that it's going to get any better. More than 1 million people have fled the country because they don't want to be in the military and they fear what would happen to them next. And you know who fled the most? Those with the most education. They have such a deficit now for IT jobs that the salaries are just out of control because there's just so few people that could do highly technical work. guys who were smart enough to know that there was no coming back once they went to the Russian military, so they got out of town. So, looking ahead, what do you think we should expect to see in the near future with Russia?
I think we may be looking uh, at Russia's high watermark militarily. That's kind of a big statement to say. I see Russia's continued stasis on the battlefield. They may not be losing any territory, but they are eating their own army apart. Their morale is abysmal. The medical care is abysmal. The manner in which they treat their soldiers, you have a guy crawling towards the front line. Just ask yourself, what were his choices? Right? Someone said, I'm going to kill you right here, or you get on your crutches and go towards the enemy. History shows us, Jason, that armies like that fall to pieces in an instant. And Vladimir Putin should never forget in his mind Ceausescu giving that speech on the roof of the cultural center and then the mob turned on him, or Colonel Gaddafi. Those sorts of governments are monolithic and unimpeachable until they're not. And we may be looking at that eventually in Russia. But there is no doubt the economy is in trouble and militarily they're flatlining.
That's what they always say, is that dictatorships, they look like they're so firm, they're so strong, but in fact, they're very brittle. With just a little bit of pressure, they will crack. And history showed that even those dictatorships that everybody was sure would endure forever, they didn't. One day they ended. So I think there's a lot of reason for us to be optimistic about what will happen next.
Well, absolutely. Well, Munich is going to be I don't think a momentous moment, but it's going to be a very important moment in the history of this war. And again, I think all parties should remember, with the exception of Mr. Lavrov, who no one is really going to talk to, but there should be no rush here into an arrangement with Putin, who truly, by the way, no one can expect him to honor anything that he agrees with. You simply cannot expect him to do that. So I think that's what's going to be unfolding around Munich. But you and I will talk about what actually happens when the conference winds up.
Absolutely, Chuck. Well, listen, let's talk after the conference wraps up and we can recap what happened there and what's going to happen next. Chuck, great talking with you as always.
Thank you, Jason. Talk to you soon.